Well, welcome to today's devotion, everyone. So glad you've joined me. We're in John chapter 13 as we continue our journey through the Gospel of John. In this chapter, Jesus is in Jerusalem the last week before his crucifixion. He's in the upper room with his disciples. They are observing the Jewish Passover meal. And at one point during dinner, to dramatize, to illustrate, if you will, some of what Jesus is teaching them that evening, because they're sitting around that table and he's doing a lot of teaching. And to dramatize that, some of that teaching, to illustrate it, he gets up from the table and girds himself with a towel and then proceeds to wash his disciples' feet. In their culture, people would travel wearing, think of it as sandals essentially, and when you would go into a house, there was usually water so you could wash your feet, or if it was a wealthy person, they might have a servant or a slave who would wash your feet because they would get dirty traveling. And so Jesus goes over and washes their feet, not the kind of thing that the owner or master or head of the house usually did. And so it's a familiar story. But what spoke to me was in the early verses of chapter 13, we get this really clear sense that Jesus was self-aware, that Jesus knew who he was. So look at verse 3 of chapter 13. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from the Father and was going back to God, that he was getting ready to be crucified, raised, and then ascend back to the Father in heaven. So he knew who he was. He got up from supper, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then in verse 5, he poured water into a basin, to a bowl, if you will, and a wash pan. And he began to wash the disciples' feet and then to wipe them, to dry them with the towel. And, as I said, verse 3 makes it clear Jesus was self-aware. He knew who he was. And even later in the conversation, as he's washing their feet, Jesus says to them in verse 13, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." Jesus knew he was their Lord, and yet he washes their feet. And one of the things he's teaching in this chapter, when you read this story and the rest of the chapter, is that serving others is how we love others. Notice how the chapter begins, chapter 13, verse 1. "Now, before the feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come," that it was time for him to be crucified and so on, that he would depart out of this world, his ascension back to the Father, notice this at the end of verse 1, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus loved those who were his, and he loved them up to the very end. And then you skip ahead in chapter 13 to the end of it, verse 34, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even just as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And so, sandwiched between these verses at the beginning and the end of the chapter on love, Jesus loving his own and then commanding us to love one another, fellow believers, sandwiched between is this story of Jesus our Lord washing the disciples' feet. There is no love without serving. Think about it in the family. Think about it in your church. Think about it in your marriage. Serving is loving. Loving is serving. You might serve occasionally without loving, but you cannot love without serving. No one is so important they don't need to serve, to love by serving. And it's what Jesus did And it's what he commanded us to do. Now, in this story, the issue is not washing feet. There's nothing wrong with that act. There are some denominations that practice that as an ordinance of the church, like baptism and Lord's Supper. They have a third one, foot washing. That's not the issue. He's not commanding us so much, to wash feet. That was a practical thing that was done and needed, and he, being the Lord, doing it, that's what was unusual. And so he's teaching us that whoever we are, that all of us need to be willing to serve, that loving is serving. Why do we serve? Because that's simply what love does. And that is what Jesus is teaching here. And I hope that helps you to understand why it's important that the people you love in your family, in your church, you find ways to serve them, because that is what love does. Hey, God bless you. And I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 14.